Chapter 4. A Secret No Longer. For several weeks, it seemed that the prayers and good luck symbols had done their work well. Sadako felt strong and healthy as she ran longer and faster. But all that ended one crisp, cold winter day in February. Sadako was running in the schoolyard. Suddenly, everything seemed to whirl around her, and she sank to the ground. One of the teachers rushed over to help. I guess I'm just tired," Sadako said in a weak voice. When she tried to stand up, her legs went wobbly, and she fell down again. The teacher sent Mitsu home to tell Mr. Sasaki. He left his barber shop and took Sadako to the Red Cross hospital. As they entered the building, Sadako felt a pang of fear. Part of this hospital was especially for those with the atom bomb sickness. In a few minutes, Sadako was in an examining room where a nurse x-rayed her chest and took some blood. Dr. Numata tapped her back and asked a lot of questions. 3 other doctors came in to look at Sadako. One of them shook his head and gently stroked her hair. By now, the rest of Sadako's family was at the hospital. Her parents were in the doctor's office. Sadako could hear the murmur of their voices. Once her mother cried, "Leukemia? But that's impossible!" At the sound of that frightening word, Sadako put her hands over her ears. She didn't want to hear any more. Of course she didn't have leukemia. Why, the atom bomb hadn't even scratched her. Nurse Yasunaga took Sadako to one of the hospital rooms and gave her a kind of cotton kimono to wear. Sadako had just climbed into bed when her family came in. Mrs. Sasaki put her arms around Sadako. "You must stay here for a little while," she said, trying to sound cheerful, "but I'll come every evening." "And we'll visit you after school," Masahiro promised. Mitsu and Iji nodded, their eyes wide and scared. "Do I really have the atom bomb disease?" Sadako asked her father. There was a troubled look in Mr. Sasaki's eyes, but he only said, "The doctors want to make some tests, that's all." He paused. Then he added, "They might keep you here for a few weeks." A few weeks? To Sadako, it sounded like years. She would miss graduation into junior high school. And even worse, she would not be part of the racing team. Sadako swallowed hard and tried not to cry. Mrs. Sasaki fussed over Sadako. She plumped the pillows and smoothed the bedspread. Mr. Sasaki cleared his throat. Is there anything you want?" he asked. Sadako shook her head. All she really wanted was to go home. But when? A cold lump of fear grew in her stomach. She had heard that many people who went into this hospital never came out. Later, Nurse Yasunaga sent the others away so that Sadako could rest. When she was alone, Sadako buried her face in the pillow and cried for a long time. She had never before felt so lonely and miserable. Chapter 5. The Golden Crane. The next morning, Sadako woke up slowly. She listened for the familiar sounds of her mother making breakfast, but there were only the new and different sounds of a hospital. Sadako sighed. She had hoped that yesterday was just a bad dream. It was even more real when Nurse Yasunaga came in to give her a shot. "Getting shots is part of being in the hospital," the plump nurse said briskly. "You'll get used to it." "I just want the sickness to be over with," Sadako said unhappily, "so I can go home." That afternoon, Chizuko was Sadako's first visitor. She smiled mysteriously as she held something behind her back. "Shut your eyes," she said. While Sadako squinted her eyes tightly shut, Chizuko put some pieces of paper and scissors on the bed. "Now you can look," she said. "What is it?" Sadako asked, staring at the paper. Chizuko was pleased with herself. "I figured out a way for you to get well," she said proudly. "Watch!" She cut a piece of gold paper into a large square. In a short time, she had folded it over and over into a beautiful crane. Sadako was puzzled. "But how can that paper bird make me well?" "Don't you remember that old story about the crane?" Chizuko asked. "It's supposed to live for 1,000 years. If a sick person folds 1,000 paper cranes, the gods will grant her wish and make her healthy again." She handed the crane to Sadako. Here's your first one." Sadako's eyes filled with tears. How kind of Shizuko to bring a good luck charm, especially when her friend didn't really believe in such things. Sadako took the golden crane and made a wish. The funniest little feeling came over her when she touched the bird. It must be a good omen. "Thank you, Shizuko-chan," she whispered. "I'll never part with it." When she began to work with the paper, Sadako discovered that folding a crane wasn't as easy as it looked. With Chizuko's help, she learned how to do the different difficult parts. After making 10 birds, Sadako lined them up on the table beside the golden crane. Some were a bit lopsided, but it was a beginning. "Now I have only 990 to make," Sadako said. With the golden crane nearby, she felt safe and lucky. Why, in a few weeks she would be able to finish the 1,000. Then she would be strong enough to go home. That evening, Masahiro brought Sadako's homework from school. When he saw the cranes, he said, "There isn't enough room on that small table to show off your birds. I'll hang them from the ceiling for you." Sadako was smiling all over. "Do you promise to hang every crane I make?" she asked. Masahiro promised. "That's fine," Sadako said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Then you'll hang the whole 1,000? 1,000? Her brother groaned. "You're joking." Sadako told him the story of the cranes. Masahiro ran a hand through his straight black hair. "You tricked me," he said with a grin, "but I'll do it anyhow." He borrowed some thread and tacks from Nurse Yasunaga and hung the first 10 cranes. The golden crane stayed in its place of honor on the table. After supper, Mrs. Sasaki brought Mitsu and Ichi to the hospital. Everyone was surprised to see the birds. They reminded Mrs. Sasaki of a famous old poem. "Out of colored paper, cranes come flying into our house." Mitsu and Ichi liked the golden crane best, but Mrs. Sasaki chose the tiniest one made of fancy green paper with pink parasols on it. "This is my choice," she said, "because small ones are the most difficult to make." After visiting hours, it was lonely in the hospital room, so lonely that Sadako folded more cranes to keep up her courage. 11, I wish I'd get better. 12, I wish I'd get better.